Krista here with Books and Jams, and I am here today to give you my first weekly wrap-up of the books that I'm reading in the month of March. The reason that I'm doing a weekly wrap-up instead of my end-of-the-month wrap-up is because I've given myself the crazy challenge to read a book a day for middle grade March. This is insane, and I don't know if I'll be able to actually complete it, but the goal is to have 31 books completed by the end of the month. As of right now, I'm happy to announce that I am one book ahead, which is fantastic. I know that towards the end of the month, I have some books that are a little thicker that I would like to read, and it might be a little tricky to keep up this pace. So most of the ones you'll see in this pile so far are pretty thin. I don't know how it will go continuing forward. But as of right now, I'm one book ahead, and I'm totally thrilled about that. I've read some fantastic books. First book that I completed in the month of March is The Twits by Roald Dahl. This completes the challenge of read a childhood favorite. This is a very well-loved book for my childhood, and I had a lot of nostalgia as I was reading it. This is the story of Mr. and Mrs. Twit, who are delightfully awful. They are dirty and smelly and mean and horrid to each other. And the first half of the book tells about different practical jokes that they play on each other. These two not only treat each other horribly, but they also treat the animals around them horribly. They trap the birds in their yard, and they have monkeys that they treat really poorly. And so these animals in the second half of the book kind of have a revolt and put up a stink and work together to get back at the Twits. It's a silly read. It's a lot of fun. I'm not sure if I would have loved it as much as an adult if I didn't have all of the nostalgia attached to it, but it was quite funny and just ridiculously awful. A lot of inappropriate, raucous humor, which Roald Dahl is famous for, and which I, as a child, absolutely loved because it was so unexpected for the most of the books that I would read. I really enjoyed reading this, and it was a great way to start middle grade March for me. The second book that I finished is one that I actually started in February, and I read The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. I was super hesitant going into this because I tend to not care as much about hyped books. And so this is super duper hyped, and it deals with some pretty tough topics. So I just wasn't sure what I was going to think of it. But so many people love it, and I knew I needed to read it and see what I thought for myself. At the beginning, I still wasn't convinced as the story was starting. It's about this 16-year-old girl named Star. She is a very typical 16-year-old girl in a lot of ways. And so I wasn't sure I was going to really care about the rest of the story. However, once it got going, I really changed how I felt about the book as a whole, and about Star as a character, and about the writing of Angie Thomas. I really think that this is an important book, and I really loved it. In Star's neighborhood where she lived, there's a ton of gang activity and drug dealers and just a rough neighborhood overall. And so her parents send her and her brothers to a private school out in the suburbs, which is predominantly white. Star is living in between these two worlds. She has friends that she's known since she was a kid from her neighborhood, and then friends that she met through school, and those two groups of people do not mix. And Star kind of changes who she is depending upon which group that she's with. And so that conflict is really strong throughout this book, and her trying to figure out how to be who she is in both of these settings, which in a lot of ways is very typical for a 16-year-old, figuring out who you are and how to be the truest version of who you are. In the midst of this conflict, Star is in the car with one of her childhood friends from her neighborhood. They get pulled over, and he ultimately gets shot by the cop who pulls them over and dies. And so we have this storyline going all the way through of the people in the neighborhood really feeling the injustice of this situation. And Star is kind of caught in the crosshairs. At first, she doesn't want anybody to know that she was the witness to the event, but she comes to a point where she realizes that she needs to speak up. This book is very heavy and yet very relatable, even though I am not in her situation and I cannot relate to the degree of so many other people. I felt the tension. I felt the process that she went through to figure out what she was going to do. I felt the grieving. Some of those things, I can relate to those feelings and emotions. While there is some strong language in this book, it felt appropriate for the setting and for the conversations that were happening. It didn't feel unnecessary. But yeah, I feel like this is a super important book. And I know I talked about this probably more than I'll talk about the other ones that I read this month so far. But I really am glad to say that I am joining the hype train for this one. Go into it knowing what you're getting into, but it is a very good, heavy read. The third book that I read is totally different. It's called The Willoughbys by Lois Lowry. I've read other books by Lois Lowry, including The Giver, and really liked them. So when I saw this one, it just has a different kind of a feel to it. I was very interested to give it a try. This is almost satire of children's books. In this story, we have a family of 4 children who are kind of trying to get away from their parents, and their parents don't like the children. It kind of plays off of tropes in middle grade books in a very light-hearted way. There's the millionaire who finds a baby on his doorstep and decides to raise her. There's the nanny that comes in to rescue and save the day. The parents who are absent and off traveling the world, and the orphaned children. It's quite funny, very short, quick read. It was interesting. It didn't blow me away, but I thought it was a fun read. The fourth book I finished on audiobook, and it was A Long Walk to Water. This is by, I don't know. Oh my goodness, I don't know who this is by. I will put a picture of it here. A Long Walk to Water is nonfiction. Tells the story of a boy who is one of the lost boys of Sudan. While he is in school one day, fighting or shooting breaks out near him, and his class has to escape into the bush in the Sudan and begin walking to a refugee camp. It's not safe for them to go back to their village and find their families even. Along the way, he joins up with other groups of refugees who are also walking to refugee camps. Interspersed throughout his story, we have the story of another little girl in the Sudan whose story happens decades later. And so it just tells about her having to walk every day, or 2 hours to go get water, and then 2 hours back, and then a couple hours later has to go do it again. At one point, these two storylines intersect. I thought this was super interesting. It was a very short audiobook, only just under 3 hours long. It's a sad part of history for a lot of people, and it was interesting to read that book. The fifth book that I finished in March was The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This is one that was on my 2018 TBR shelf, and so I'm knocking them off slowly but surely. This is a classic book about a little girl whose parents die in India. She is sent to live with family in England. She is super grumpy and very spoiled at the beginning of this book. She kind of grew up getting her own way. Nobody told her no, ever. So she is very spoiled and very grumpy and very surly. She comes to live with her uncle, is taken care of by members of his household. He is often away. She wanders the grounds, and in the course of her wanderings, she discovers this garden that has been locked up for a decade. She finds the key and wants to transform this garden and see if it's still alive. And so throughout the course of this book, she learns a lot about gardening. She learns a lot about herself. She learns a lot about how to be kind and deal with other people in a much more respectful way. Her total countenance changes, and there are some surprises in there. So if you haven't read this, I'm not going to say much more than that. I found this book to be very lovely. Perfect to read at this time of year, especially in the next couple of weeks as more and more flowers will start to be blooming and it will start to get warmer as the spring comes. It's a perfect spring read. So if you haven't yet read The Secret Garden, I would highly recommend this book. I found it to be very easy to read and a lovely story. The next book I finished in March is Pippi Longstocking by Astrid Lindgren. This is another book that I loved when I was a kid. I did not love it this time around, but it was a lot of fun. Pippi is spunky and creative, and another orphan tale. She lives on her own in her home, which is called Villa Villa Kula. She befriends Tommy and Annika, who live next door. Each chapter is not really connected to the chapters before it. There is a little bit of a thread that runs through, but it almost reads a lot more like short stories than a detailed plot that's going to keep your attention all the way through. This one was a little bit slower of a read for me. I actually did start it in January. I am glad that I finished it this month, though. The next book was another audiobook, and that was The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. I am planning on reading through the Chronicles of Narnia in 2018. This is the continuing story of Narnia. In this book, Lucy and Edmund and Susan and Peter make their way to Narnia, and they begin to have adventures there. It is a fun tale of traveling to another world. I'm sure most of you know this story. I've never listened to the whole Chronicles of Narnia on audio. I am excited to read through them in that format this year. The next book that I finished was a buddy read, which I did with Jess and Christina from Game of Tomes, and that is A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine. This is a movie that's coming out today, but I am not going to see it until next week probably, because I don't like the mad rush and the crush and being crowded in the theater because it's opening day. This is a story of Meg and her little brother Charles Wallace and a neighbor or friend that they meet named Kelvin, and they end up traveling sort of through time and space to look for and rescue Meg's father, who has been missing for a few years. I think almost 5 years. Meg is a bit annoying. She's a bit annoying at the beginning. She is a little bit angsty, which is not super common in middle grade books, but she's been grieving her father being gone. Her teachers and principal are not very understanding, which is a pet peeve of mine in middle grade and young adult books. I hate when the adults are not realistic in that way. But it is a strange and wild ride as they meet these 3 eccentric women who assist them in their journey to find her father. The descriptions and plot were so creative and whimsical in a way that I think it would be a super fun read for middle graders. But I also thought that there were some themes and a slight Christian allegory going on that can speak to us as adults as well. I really enjoyed this read. I loved reading it with Jess and Christina and talking about it with them. And I think I have a middle grade convert, Christina. Woohoo! She does not read a lot of middle grade. And after reading this, she is inspired and motivated to try some more, which really makes my heart happy. So I'm really glad I read this with them. The next book I finish is by far my favorite book of the month so far, and we'll see if any others can top this one. And that is The Wishtree by Katherine Applegate. This book is about a tree named Red, who is a grand old oak tree who has seen and observed so much in his long life. He has been content to be a silent observer until one day he decides to break that silence in a way. There's a family that moves into one of the homes on either side of him that is not exactly welcomed in the community. In particular, there's a little girl in this family who has befriended a lot of the animals who live in Red's branches. This book is funny, it's heartwarming, it's just a lovely story about acceptance and friendship, and I think you should read it. For sure. The 10th book that I just finished today was recommended to me by one of the librarians on my many trips to the library in the last few weeks. This is written by a local author. It's called Summer of the Woods. It's book 1 in the Virginia Mysteries by Stephen K. Smith. I enjoy a good middle grade mystery, but this one did not exactly hit the spot for me. In the midst of all of the wonderful books that I've been reading this month, this one fell a little bit short. It felt very simple. I didn't care as much for the writing style. However, I do feel like young readers would probably enjoy this. I might have enjoyed it a lot more as a child, but I don't think this transcends to be appreciated by adults as much as some of the other ones I've read this month. So I will not be continuing with this series, but it was fun to read from a local author, and I think as the series goes on, there are other books that take place in different areas around Richmond, which is where I live, and I think that's pretty cool, especially for kids in this region. I just want to real quick at the end here show you the books that I'm in the middle of. I started today listening to the audiobook of Ekko because it's a chunker. I'm not going to tell you about what this is, but I will say that the beginning of the audiobook is lovely. It starts out with kind of a fairy tale feel, but this is going to be historical fiction as well, which is very interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing how that all plays out. The audiobook is over 10 hours, so it will take me a while until this is included in my list of completed books. But I'm also reading The War That Saved My Life, which is one that's on my TBR because I'm reading this for my diversity pick. And this is about a little girl with a club foot who is escaping London during World War II to go live outside of the city. I guess a lot of children were sent on a train out of the city to be protected from the war. So she is not going to be sent by her horrid mother, but she escapes with her little brother. She learns to walk on her foot. Her mother treats her just awfully. I'm only like a teeny tiny bit in, so I don't know much more than that, but I know that this is going to be a book that I love. And the third book that I'm currently about almost a third through is Jane Steele by Lindsay Fay, and this is my Goodreads read-along pick for the month of March, and just about the only adult book that I will be reading this month. So I'm looking forward to continuing reading this throughout this week. Here are the books that I've read so far this month, in addition to the 2 audiobooks that I've completed. I am on a roll, you guys. I'm so excited that Middle Grade March has started off with such a bang for me, and I love watching all of your videos and hearing your comments about what you're reading down below. So be sure to comment and let me know, again, what book that you're currently in the middle of, or your favorite read of the month so far, if you've read a few. And let me know if you've read any of these or want to talk about any of them or have any questions about any of them. I love chatting with you down in the comments. Be sure to give this video a big thumbs up and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And I will be talking to you in another video very soon. Bye!